All right, well, let's go ahead and get right into. Oh, first, I should ask: is everybody able to access the test? Any problems with that?
I haven't tried yet. I've seen it
Okay, so you've seen it at least. Well, that's good.
up there.
All right, well, I just want to make sure that it's up and available. Tend to have technology problems like this morning. Well, let's get right into integrated pest management, chapter 15. And let me share my screen here. All right. So, of course, integrated pest management is a huge deal. Why? Well, the big reason is because our annual losses of crops are basically estimated in the hundreds of billions of dollars. Pest control is a multi-billion-dollar industry, considering not just the damage that pests do, but also the cost of control measures. And they're actually pretty close to being about the same. We spend a ton of money on pest control to achieve a fairly constant level of control. So, and that's mostly due to the adaptation of the pests to different growing situations. Anytime we're producing crops, we're altering an ecosystem. And in altering an ecosystem, we're providing a favorable habitat for our crops, but also for pests. So it's often estimated at worldwide about half of the world's food production alone is lost to pests. So it's a big deal, and it's really as we call it now, integrated management. It's a holistic system that incorporates many different branches of science, including chemistry and botany, weed science, entomology, plant pathology, a little bit of everything. So you got to be well-rounded scientists to be a crop producer as well. So the book often calls it integrated plant health management, which is fine, but I'm changing that to integrated pest management, IPM, because that is what we most commonly refer to it as in the industry. And it can look at several different methods of not just controlling, but preventing pest establishment in a management system. So we use both tools to manage pests as well as strategies and tactics together as a system. And really, we need to look at it on a per crop basis. And for the crop project, as you all know, we're having you list the key pests that are associated with each crop, as there are usually several of these. There's usually at least one or two really big problems that are always associated with every crop. For tomatoes, for instance, tomato blight, as well as other abiotic conditions as well. So we outline about kind of 5 different methods, and kind of altered these a little bit from what was talked about in the book. But first, we have cultural practices, and that's basically anything that we do for the cultivation of the crops and how we might alter those practices in order to try to prevent or deter pests. And they separate genetic resistance out, but really, usually we include genetic resistance as a cultural practice. And that's usually the selection of resistant varieties to many pests. And as the science has improved over the years, and really integrated pest management really started gaining traction more in the 60s. And today is a pretty well-developed branch of crop production. But genetic resistance has increased massively not just for our crops, but for the pests as well. We also have physical and mechanical controls, which would include things like pruning or hand removal of pests, trapping, fire, etc. Probably the most thing that we think of commonly is chemical applications for control of pests. This is only a part of it, and generally chemical applications are kind of reserved as a last resort in integrated pest management. It's important to note that whenever we're using chemical applications, they're all known as pesticides, and pesticides is a general term for really anything that controls a pest, any application of some substance to control a pest. They're divided further into what they control. So herbicides for other plants, weeds, insecticides for insects, miticides for mites, antibiotics for bacteria, fungicides for fungi, and nematicides for nematodes. We also have biological control, which is, we'll talk more about, but basically just using other living organisms to control pests. And also just government regulatory measures, which we'll talk more about here in a little bit. And really, it depends on you what you're going to use and your cropping system. So it's going to vary no matter what. And really, we should plan to create a management strategy that includes everything, really. Let's talk about cultural practices first. Again, that's basically anything that altering of your crop production in order to try to prevent, first of all, and to potentially control pests as well. One big thing here with cultural practices is that a healthy plant naturally has the ability to resist a lot of different pests. So we're going to try to provide the optimal environment for crops in terms of light, water, and nutrients to make sure that we have healthy plants and the best plant growth possible to resist pest infestation in the first place. One of the things that we look at, and they talk about this as the disease triangle, but really we look at it for any type of pest. In order to actually have damage, we have to have, one, a susceptible host, an environment that's favorable for the pest itself, and then the presence of the pest, whether that's an insect, a mite, a pathogen, whatever. We have to have all those three things occurring at once. So if you think about that, then we can use different preventative measures to try to, again, just prevent the pests in the first place. And I think it was Benjamin Franklin said that an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. And I would argue that actually you could probably quantify it to say that an ounce of prevention could be worth more than a pound of cure in pest management. So looking at cultural practices, some of the things that we might do, practicing particular types of tillage or perhaps no tillage at all to control or prevent weeds, also to bury insects and any residues, crop residues that plant pathogens might exist on. Making sure that we have proper irrigation and drainage. Making sure that we have the proper fertilization, using crop rotation, and just sterilization, keeping your tools and your environment clean and free of pathogens and any pest eggs, etc. We're looking at genetic host resistance. Main thing we're looking at is using genetically resistant plants to basically, especially in terms of areas where we might have the key pests present. For instance, In eggplant, one of the key pests in our region is flea beetles. And there are actually quite a few varieties of eggplant out there that are just resistant to flea beetles in and of themselves. So in some cases, this might be the only cost-effective way to manage pests or disease. Lots of good things that are associated with genetic resistance. In nature, it kind of happens on its own, survival of the fittest, right? Plants that are susceptible to diseases or insects will tend to die off and not be able to breed, while those that are remaining will breed and then become more resistant over generations. One of the big problems we have with pests on the other side of the genetic resistance coin is that they have more generations than our crops, and in so much they are able to basically get better resistance to any pesticide treatments we might provide. So we have to look at multiple measures in pest management. Generally, traditional breeding as well as some genetic engineering has really increased the ability for our crops to resist pests and maintain good yields. It's also interesting to note that there have been some studies out there that have looked at land races or heirloom varieties of crops, and many of those are already adapted for particular pests and particular environments, mostly because the people that kind of developed those crops early on did not have access to control measures. So whenever we look at an ability for the plant to maintain its yield in spite of pest pressure, we talk about tolerance. And of course, this genetic resistance can try to prevent costly pesticide applications. That's one of the big things that I think one of the reasons why we use chemical controls kind of as a last resort is because pesticides are expensive, not just to use, not just to buy the pesticide itself, but also to apply it. They often require specialized equipment. Also, pesticides can potentially be dangerous to people as well as to our crops, the environment, and the ecology too. And really, pest management deals a lot with ecology, so that's something that we have to look at. We may have a key pest that is, when left unchecked, does a lot of damage, but then when we control that key pest, secondary pests could also become a problem. So we have to look at the issues associated with pesticides, and that's why we kind of try to use them more as a last resort instead of a, kind of the number one go-to. It's often a quick fix, but in many cases, they don't even really work that well. We talk about biological control. We're, again, using other organisms to control our pest organisms, and that could be accomplished through parasitization, which is basically where an insect would, or nematode, or any other thing really, would lay its eggs or basically feed on that organism without completely killing it, at least initially. We just have competition alone, competing for the same resources. In some cases, they might produce toxins that kill or make the pests less able to do damage. And in some cases, they might even create some changes to the crop itself, making it less susceptible to pathogen attack. And there's a kind of a newer variety of, you wouldn't really call them pesticides, but more like probiotics that a lot of organic growers use, that are basically sprays that are used to make the crop itself more resistant to pests. A lot of times what we do really affects the proliferation of pests themselves. So again, using chemicals often can affect ecological balance and cause pest explosions in many cases. Say population explosions rather than pest explosions. Pests themselves are not exploding there. For the government regulatory measures, I'm sure if any of you have traveled to particular states, you may have been stopped, especially by car, at a border to check to see if you are, carrying any produce or anything, any firewood. These are because they have quarantines in place to try to prevent pests from being spread in the first place. There are lots of examples of huge pest problems that we've spread just through international trade. So today there are lots of regulations that are kind of designed to prevent that. Some examples of these might include like chestnut blight, for instance. Chestnuts used to be the dominant canopy tree in the eastern United States, but we imported Chinese chestnuts, and in doing so also imported a fungus that killed most of the chestnuts out there. We have a similar thing going on today with hemlocks. We accidentally introduced hemlock woolly adelgia that is decimating hemlock populations throughout the East.
The airport check is the craziest one, because I've been overseas and come back.
Mm-hmm.
That they just have, it's probably a row of like 30 lines of where they're checking seeds and all that kind of stuff. If you have anything biological, I think you have to go through there.
It can be a big holdup too if you've done some international travel, right? Yeah. It's crazy, but they do. I mean, they work. They have, greatly decreased, but that doesn't mean that some things don't slip through the cracks. And of course, you can get permits to import things too.
Yeah, well, it's surprising that more stuff doesn't slip through the cracks.
It really is. We had a friend visit from Peru, and he snuck some seeds in.
Could have killed the whole plant population of Peru.
Yeah, which was kind of funny, but apparently it's in some cases easier to get into the United States than it can be to take things out of the U.S. I guess that just probably depends on which airport you're going through, et cetera. But yeah, that's just a good example, really, of those regulatory controls and how they actually work pretty well. Let's talk about weeds for a second. One of the things I like to say about weeds is that weeds are often plants whose virtues we have yet to well understand. Many things that we consider weeds actually are useful in some manner. And a lot of weeds have been introduced because of their uses. Weeds are not just non-native plants either. There can be, really a weed is determined by the actual, crop producer themselves. It's anything that really can interfere with your production. But I would really stress that you should look at weeds for their particular or potential values in some cases, because they're not all bad. So anything that competes with desired plants for the things that they need, water, nutrient, and sunlight, might interfere with harvesting or reducing the crop's quality or appeal. It might harbor, in many cases really bad weeds do harbor other pests, and it could also compete with the crop for things like pollinators. So one of the things that we look at in terms of weeds are just their life cycle itself, whether it's an annual, biennial, or perennial. And how we manage it is going to be based on its life cycle and knowing when the most susceptible part of its life cycle is. The term invasive weed species is actually a federally defined term. It has to be a non-native plant, first of all. something introduced usually from another country. And the other part of the definition is that its introduction is likely to cause some sort of economic or environmental or human health harm. Of course, invasive species aren't just limited to plants. That could be insects, animals, anything really could be an invasive species. Here's just an image of a corn plot where there's been weed control versus one where there is not. And as you can see, the crops on the left are not doing as well. And weeds, of course, can have a dramatic effect on yields. And really, one of the biggest things that we spend money on is the cultivation, the taking care of weeds, and time, especially energy. Labor is huge in weed control. So big thing in annual weeds, they really rely on massive seed production, but also just the ability for the seed to remain viable in the soil seed bank. So looking at this graph, you can see that some of these, like lamb's quarters, which is something I don't often consider really as a weed that much because it's a harvestable plant too. We used to actually let it grow and we would harvest it and sell it to people. We also call it wild spinach, and it's actually more nutritious than spinach. Nonetheless, just look at some of these things that might, cause it to be a weed. One, it can produce up to 500,000 seeds per plant. And those seeds can remain viable for 39 years in the soil. So pretty big deal right there. Also looking at just the asexual reproduction of weeds as well. A lot of the perennial weeds are big problems because they've developed specialized structures that allow them to vegetatively propagate themselves. So in picture A, they say they've got Johnson grass there. I don't think that's actually Johnson grass. But nonetheless, either way, you see these long rhizomes here. That's like an underground kind of horizontally growing stem. Anytime that you cut that stem, it can create a new plant. And of course, it's able to make these runners and pop up new plants in other places. We got stolons here, kind of a different organ on the white clover. Again, I don't really consider white clover as a weed because it has virtues. It can fix nitrogen and it can control other weeds. So in some cases, people will actually undersow crops with white clover to get a little bit of extra nitrogen and compete with other weeds. So anyway, you have to look at it on a per weed basis and judge whether it's really a weed in your own situation or not. Another big characteristic of weeds is their genetic variability. I mean, thinking about how many individuals they are able to produce, and they breed, they're easily genetically variable. And they can adapt easy. There's also a phenomenon known as phenotypic plasticity, where maybe the genetics might not be all that different, but they respond to different environments differently. So in a particular situation, it could be a weed, whereas like say in irrigated crops, you could have something be a major weed problem, but if it's just natural rainfall, it might not be as big of a deal. So phenotypic plasticity is just the ability for these plants to adapt to different environments. So what do we do for cultural weed control? Often we do things like trying to prevent weeds in the first place, using the time of planting, maybe altering our crop row spacing, or maybe even planting multiple crops or undersowing crops. Also, crop rotation itself can be effective in weed control, especially if you're using what I like to call smother crops, things that have large leaf area like squash, or perhaps things that like root crops that you have to harvest pull out of the soil, and in doing so, you're removing a lot of the weeds in the harvest. Cover crops can really suppress weed germination and effectively compete with not only existing weed species, but some that would come later. Another thing that cover crops can display is allelopathy. And allelopathy is basically just the leaching of some suppressive toxins into the soil by plants. So we actually can have that on both ends. You can plant cover crops that can do that. Some mustards actually have this kind of biofumigant effect. But we can also have allelopathy from weeds that affect our crops, like crabgrass, for instance. It's very allelopathic and releases these chemicals that basically prevent other plants from germinating and can dwarf other plants too. Looking at mechanical weed control, that's basically the use of any type of machinery. And we can kind of think of that. There's also physical control too. You might use, the difference there is whether it's mechanical or not. Using these tools, rotary hoes, cultivators, discs and harrows, etc., on a large scale, but on a small scale, I'm sure many of you that have practiced some form of agriculture have probably done some hand hoeing at some point, right? Mowing and weed eating can be an important method in many cases as well. And one big thing that I want to try to point out with mechanical control, if you're not actually removing the plant itself, one thing that we really need to examine is trying to prevent the production of seed. If you have weeds that are competing with your crop, the best thing you can do is, if they've already done damage, is at least try to prevent them from making more seeds and making more weeds. We often use many different forms of mulching to suppress weeds, whether those are organic mulches that decay and then become organic matter, or today we use, especially in vegetable production, we use a lot of plastic and fabric mulches that we lay down. Really common, especially in organic production. Fire is one of my favorites. I'm not a pyromaniac. I prefer the term pyrotechnician. But we have really big weed infestations. We might burn crop residues and the weeds along with them to try to get rid of potential seeds. It also actually can release some nutrients into crop production as well. There are also these specialized flame weeders that exist, and it's basically just a torch connected to a propane tank. Those are fun to use. And we can also use actually biological weed control. Usually that is through herbivory, where we've introduced an insect often that will eat the plant. It's not really often used. There aren't a ton of cases where it's easy and practical to use, but it can be used. Also, we could potentially introduce diseases. That's kind of risky though, but it is a possible method to use. Chemical weed control, we look at the use of herbicides, and they have different characteristics that might affect your selection of them. So a few things that we look at when using herbicides is, one, the selectivity, two, the timing of application, how much of it you're using, and the mode of action of the herbicide itself. How does it actually kill the plant? In terms of selectivity, generally have either grass killers, broadleaf killers, or non-selective. And some of those have different categories and different degrees of their selectivity. In some cases, there are actually more specialized herbicides for particular crops. So that's important to research. We can look at herbicides in terms of the use of timing. So a burn down herbicide would be one that we would apply to weeds that already exist in a field prior to planting. Pre-plant herbicides, those often burn down are pre-plant herbicides that we apply before the crop is planted. And they could be pre-emergent herbicides if you're transplanting, but if you're starting from seed, pre-emergents don't work. So generally pre-emergents, if you're growing from seed, are applied after the crop is planted, but before the emergence of the weeds. We also have post-emergents, which are applied directly to the plants after the weeds emerge. And this table is just talking about the different modes of action for different types of chemicals, different active ingredients in herbicide formulations. So you don't have to memorize those or anything, but interesting to look at and to see how they actually work. One of the big problems that we have with pests is that a lot of our crop production is now in monocultures where we're just growing one crop in very large quantities, often just one crop per field. And with that, especially if it's just one variety, that can make the crop more susceptible to weed, not just weeds, but all pests. A good example of that is the Irish potato famine caused by potato blight. They were only growing one type of potato. There are many varieties of potatoes out there that are resistant, but the one potato that they were growing throughout the whole country was very susceptible to the blight, and it basically caused the famine. All right, so we're going to look here at some pesticides and some of the basic ideas of pesticides. First, synthetic pesticides were discovered and developed shortly after World War II, and mostly that was from leftover chemicals from warfare that we have used. All right, so let's look at some insects and mites real quick. Of course, remember that many insects actually are good for agriculture. Pollinators, for instance, other beneficial insects that might be predators of pests. So think about the balance, right? So knowing that not all insects are bad, I think, is important. Here's just an example here of a biological control of pests. So we have a type of ladybird beetle here eating an aphid. Over here on the right, we've got the larva of a green lacewing eating, looks like scale insects right there. So lots of different types of biological control. If we're using pesticides, we have to be sure to try to minimize the effects to the ecosystem and beneficial insects. For cultural control, just planting, not necessarily just at the right time, but planting at a planned time. So, for instance, keep referring back to eggplant, because it's pretty difficult to grow in our region and because of the flea beetle. However, if you plant larger transplants of eggplant later on, then you can kind of avoid some of the early flea beetle damage. For a lot of our cool season crops, if you have them growing in the summer, then a lot of times they are just not able to contend with pests because they're just not in the favorable environment. So they mention here that for wheat, the Hessian fly is a key pest, and they have a fly-free date, which basically if you plant after that time, then the organism doesn't have enough time to get established. So timing is a big thing with cultural control of insects. Some physical practices, different situations. You might be just leaving a field fallow for a period of time when insect pests are most active. We might try to prevent them from coming into areas by using screens on in greenhouse situations on the fans themselves, on exhaust fans, so that we're excluding them from the habitat. Also, things like row cover are really good for preventing insects from getting to the plants, at least for a time period anyway, when they're small enough to cover. Disking or removing, pruning, stuff like that, preventing the ideal habitat for them, removing their potential habitat. Also, just hand picking could be physical. These are all kind of looking at prevention of the habitat of the insect itself. Talking about insects and their other relatives, they are all in the phylum Arthropoda, which all have these kind of hard exoskeletons and particular body parts. And they are further divided into these different classes: arachnids, crustaceans, centipedes, millipedes, and of course insects. The class Insecta is by far the largest in terms of species of any taxon, of any living organism on planet Earth. Over 80% of all species of animals are insects. And most of those have no economic importance. Only about 5 of them have any direct importance to people. And only about 1% of them actually reach pest status. Listed here are just some of the insect orders, the more common ones. And this could be important to know in terms of really selectivity of insecticides. There are some insecticides that will only affect a particular order of insects. Also, there are some orders that are mostly beneficial. So we might try to avoid impacting those populations. Insects are characterized by their body parts, how they feed, their sensory organs, mostly, and as well as their type of metamorphosis, which we have some insects and mites that have no metamorphosis. The young basically look the same as the adult, and they just grow in size. We have some that undergo complete metamorphosis, and that's like your butterfly example, where we have egg, the larval stage, which is often the most damaging stage for these types of pests. A pupa stage, where they basically go in and melt down all these body parts and then emerge as an adult, which looks entirely different from the larva. Incomplete metamorphosis, they do have kind of 3 stages here, where they basically go from egg to nymph to adult, and those can look similar, but can also look different between the different stages. So those are types of metamorphosis. And in some cases, that's important to know, and what they look like in different stages of metamorphosis, in terms of when to target them, but also in terms of just identifying them and knowing what the beneficials look like versus the pests. Looking at the mode of feeding, we've got chewing insects, which are often larvae, but there are some other things that chew too. Borers are often chewers as well. These are both larval stages pictured here. We've got sucking insects and mites that basically just take those photosynthates, those metabolites, and suck them out of the plant. And often they will excrete them too, which can be attractive to other insects. For instance, aphids, commonly, you see this close up here, they have this kind of stylet here, they're poking into this leaf rib right here, sucking out those plant juices. and then they excrete this stuff known as honeydew, which is basically just that plant sugar. And ants actually will farm them. They'll protect the aphids so that they can eat their honeydew. Kind of gross, but that's what happens. One of the big problems with sucking insects is that they become vectors. A vector is anything that can introduce a pathogen. So they pick up and move plant diseases and viruses and transmit them to other plants. So in some cases, like in this case, the whitefly pictured here, they're not a major problem just on their own because they don't do direct damage to crops, but they are a vector for many different viruses. So just introducing that virus can do way more economic damage than the insect itself. All right, looking at insecticides, we got systemic insecticides that are basically consumed often by the insect and then kind of kill it from the inside, often prevent it from growing anymore. One downside of these is that they can remain on the plant tissues that could be eaten by people. And in some cases, these pesticides have some sort of pre-harvest interval period where it needs a specific amount of time between the application and before it's actually harvested or sold, so that those potentially harmful residues are no longer there. Contact, just how it sounds, these are pesticides that are only active when they actually contact the insect itself. And these are really important to note that you have to get good coverage of the crop in order to get good, take out the pests, really. Several different classes here. We've got inhalants and fumigants. Inhalants being inhaled, of course. Fumigants usually applied as a gas. We got modes of action. We got cell membrane disruption, which basically just causes the individual cells, those membranes, kind of like the cell wall in the plant, to disappear and causes them to, their contents in the bodies of the insects to just cease functioning. Several examples of those. We also have hormone disruption pesticides. These are actually fairly safe to use because they're generally targeted to classes of insects. And they're also known as insect growth regulators. They prevent them from continuing to breed. So that's several different modes of action that they do. In some cases, they might prevent the formation of chitin, which is this hard substance that is actually found in the exoskeletons of insects. And chitin disruption will prevent them from being able to molt and just disrupt their life cycle. Of course, you have to target them at the right time. There are other hormone disruptors that just prevent them from being able to breed as well. We also have pheromones, which are usually kind of used more for baiting, but it can also be used just to kind of confuse insects and not allow them to actually find their mates. We also have desiccants, which basically just dehydrate the insect itself. It often removes the membrane on the outside of the body and makes them dry up. Diatomaceous earth is a very commonly used, really safe to use desiccant that controls a lot of soft-bodied insects, often used in organic production. Desiccants, of course, work best in a dry environment. there are all kinds of chemicals out there that have been used for controlling insects, and these are governed by bodies of the government. So especially those that are harmful for humans have been actually banned from use, the registration been canceled, such as DDT, for instance. Was a really popular insecticide and for a long time was thought to be harmless, but now can't use it in the U.S. and many other countries too. All right, well, I'm going to stop there because we're out of time, and we'll come back on Monday and finish integrated management. I put up another little PowerPoint presentation on Blackboard, taking some of the insect pests out of there. I would encourage you before Monday just to look over that and just familiarize yourself with some of those. They might show up on a quiz or test. Anybody have any questions, comments, or concerns today? All right.
I got one. Are we going to try to get another test in, or are we going to make this the midterm? What's the plan?
Yeah, we're going to try to get another test in. I know we're running out of time, so we're going to try to cover as much material as we possibly can and then try to get another test in. This unit is not as big as the last one, so we'll try to kind of pare it down a little bit and make sure that we can get another test in and then the final exam.
Gotcha.
So we're not going to actually weight this test as a midterm, so we'll just kind of skip over the midterm. I'll make the final, a little bit, I'm not going to say longer, but a little bit, covering a little bit more and make it a little easier for you to, rather than having to just cram for it. So, any other questions? All right, well, you guys get in there and finish that test before Monday. It will close on Monday. If you have any questions or concerns, just let me know as soon as possible so we can address that before the test closes.
Okay.
All right, well, you all have a great rest of the week and great weekend.
Okay, you too. Bye. See y'all in Animal Science in a minute.